All right, let's move on to the pitchers. Stolen bases. Oh, yeah, Rich, thank you for that. Red Sox left field, Williams, Yaz, Rice. I ended up for the Red Sox shifting Yaz over to first base, even though they're loaded there too with Jimmy Fox and Mo Vaughn and Kevin Youkilis. There's lots of candidates there, but I had to make room for Williams and Rice. And I have heard from Red Sox fans who prefer Manny Ramirez over Jim Rice. Now, I realize there's people that don't like Jim Rice for the Hall of Fame, but when you look at only Manny's time in Boston, not his whole career, I don't understand that. I mean, Manny put up great numbers, but I have to go with Rice over Manny there. All right, let's get back to the Tigers. So starting pitching, really two super strong candidates at the very top, right? Newhouser and Verlander. You could argue about who should be number one, number two. I went with Newhouser number one, Verlander two, but I wouldn't argue that too strenuously if you want to flip those two. Then I included, I think, pretty much the top 9 or 10 here. What did I do? I had the top 9, and then I included McLean, even though he's pretty far down this list. That's a little bit of a heart thing. I mean, he had those 2 awesome seasons. He had a couple of other good seasons, and then he sort of self-destructed. But I felt like McLean needed to make an all-time Tigers. What that meant, though, was that Jim Bunning, Frank Larry, and all the others towards the bottom of the list are left off. As we saw, MLB included Max Scherzer. He had, 2 really good seasons for Detroit, another 2 pretty good seasons, and then obviously has gone on to even be better with the Nationals. But I felt like only 5 seasons from Scherzer wasn't enough. Again, if this was an expansionary team, a lot less quality candidates, a lot less history, then Scherzer's 5 seasons would probably be enough to make it. Yeah, loaded here at the top with Newhouser and Verlander, quality guys making up, say, a top 5 rotation. You could argue if you had to have a 5-man rotation, obviously Newhouser and Verlander would be in those top 2 slots, 1-2 or 2-1. Who would you guys put 3, 4, and 5? That's an interesting thing. Why don't you chime in the chat here if you let's assume everyone agrees with the top 2. Who would be 3, 4, and 5? Do you have Morris, maybe Lolich, Trout, Bridges? List your next 3.
Yeah, Bridges is a great name and had great seasons. It's good to see him ranked this high. But yeah, you don't think of him as your Game 3 starter in a virtual World Series. So it's an interesting question. Anybody else, any thoughts? Who's the number 3 starter?
It may be down the list, but I have to say, I think if I had a Game 3 starter, I might go with Bunning.
If you could base it on only 1 or 2 seasons, you might go with McLean. You might not if you had to average all of his tenure with Detroit, but certainly 68 and 69, you might go with McLean.
I would go with Lolich as a 3rd starter because of his experience, and then Morris, of course. I mean, I still remember him more for that start in the 1-0 game in Minnesota as a Twin, of course, but still, that's the kind of ice he had in his veins, and he also has some postseason success with Toronto. And Bunning would be a good 5th starter. And he never really, I mean, outside of he didn't really have much postseason experience, but still, Bunning is a good veteran to have back there, and he knows what to do every 5th day, or in that case, back in his day, every 4th day.
Definitely seeing a lot of love for Morris and Lolich in the chat in terms of some of these spots. Schoolboy Rowe got a vote. Bunning's gotten a couple of votes. Interesting, yes, that Trout barely won more games than he lost. We'd have to look up those seasons and see how good were the Tigers during his tenure. It's one of those things where, like, Nolan Ryan barely won more games than he lost, or Phil Niekro barely won more games, certain seasons at least.
Trout was on the 45 championship team, and he was a big piece there. Yeah. It's interesting, the question I asked is who would you roll out in a Game 3 and a Game 4 in a postseason series? And I didn't mean to change the question, but there, I think you'd have to go Morris or Lolich just because of their postseason performance. Now, if you're starting a season and you're going to simulate seasons, right?
Yeah.
Then that's a different question. I guess that's the question you started with. But to me, the answers are a little different depending on what.
Oh, they definitely are. They definitely are. Postseason, grit, and lots of other intangibles come into play. But if you were to start a season, who would be your 5-man rotation? That is a somewhat different question. It's interesting the way baseball works out that way.
Real quick, the trivia question of who the Tigers' all-time leader in pitcher wins is, that'll stump a lot of people at parties. Maybe not this party, but other parties.
Yeah, looks like it's Hooks Dawes. Or Doss. How is that pronounced? Doss?
I believe Doss.
Yeah. Yeah, a few would get that right. All right, so there's the starting pitchers. Relief pitchers, like I said, some teams I at least looked at more. Here for the Tigers, I really only looked at these 5. I went with Hiller and Hernandez. Didn't include Lopez and his awesome physique. Did not include Henneman. In terms of physiques, there's some great physiques that make some of these all-time dream teams, like, of course, Boog Powell, Sid Fernandez. You've got guys that are...
Frank Howard,
you know, the Bartolo Colon-esque type physiques that end up making all-time dream teams in some cases, but not Lopez. And not Todd Jones either with his embarrassing ERA. And there were so many times, I know I don't have to tell you, that I'd watch Jones out there and I'd shudder. So,
hey Tom, I got to ask you on this. I think it's Keith Law. No, it's not Keith Law's book. I think it's Brian Kenny's book, Ahead of the Curve. One of those 2 books. They call out John Hiller and Willie Hernandez as having the greatest either all-time or single-season win probability added of any relief pitcher.
Relief pitchers, yeah.
And
yeah, I remember reading that too. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's, I mean, because they're saying that's a better stat for relievers. Hiller not only racked up those numbers, but pitched in really high leverage situations. Hiller is one of the most underrated names in Tigers history, I would argue. And so, I mean, you know, once you open the door to looking at other stats, you could, you know, look at 100.
That's a great point. That is a great point.
And it's because they're relievers. They don't have other stats. They're not going to pile up big stats. And so I think it was Kenny who said that's the way to go with relievers.
That's a great point, because I made I sort of gave a self-complaint last night that WAR doesn't tell you much for relievers for various reasons that you could probably drill into and find out. And so I didn't really pay too much attention to it, even though I reported the total WAR in the top 3 WAR seasons in the book. You make a great point about win probability added. I'm going to look into that more. And for the update of the book, which I was going to do this year, but now that we don't have a full season, I'm going to do after next season, after 2021. And I may, for relievers, I may swap it out and not even report the WAR number and report WPA instead. As to your point, I read whichever book it was. I remember that comment about Hiller and Hernandez. Another great season was, I think, one of Rich Gossage's seasons in the 70s, where his WPA was super high as well. And his WAR was very high that year as well. And I think we're going to see that coming up here for Hiller's biggest year. Because one other feature of the book at the end of each chapter is I looked at seasons that had an 8 WAR or higher. Again, WAR isn't everything, but I had to, you know, use something to rank single seasons. And so here are the hitters with an 8 WAR season or higher. You see Cobb dominating the top of the list, not surprisingly. And then he shows up another couple of times. You see Heilman, Gehringer, Cash with his 1961 season, of course. K-Line makes it twice. And then Alan Trammell, 1987. That was a big home run year. I mean, he had 28, which isn't a robust number, but he had more power that year than most seasons for him, and ended up with a pretty good WAR. I suspect his defensive contribution was pretty good that year as well to get an 8.2. So interesting table, interesting the names that show up here. Interesting, you know, that Crawford never shows up here. He never had an 8 WAR season. You know, Cabrera's not on here. Interesting. His defense probably drags him down some.
I was going to say, do you know how close he came in 2012 or 2013?
Yeah, we would need to check that. I mean, Triple Crown, right? So, yeah, it's probably close, probably over 7, unless I made a huge mistake and he's not even on here, you know, and should have been. But I was pretty studious in coming up with all of this. So,
yeah, question about Greenberg. Greenberg not being here, 37, 38. Yep. MVP in 40, and was it 35? Was his first MVP?
Yeah, we'd have to check and make sure I didn't make any omissions here, but my guess is the defense contributions for both Greenberg and Cabrera maybe dragged him down a little. Also, some of Greenberg's seasons were in the 30s, late 30s, a lot of offense, and things like WAR, OPS plus, they factor that in, right? And so, you know, the like Chuck Klein's Triple Crown season, for example, the WAR for that isn't that off the charts.
Tom, by virtue of the statistic, WAR is far from perfect. The fact of the matter is there's two versions of that, right? There's Baseball Reference and the other one. One thing that I recall as I was reading your book was, and I was shocked that Kaline was only here twice. And as I was thinking about it, I said, well, maybe it's because the 60s, we had all these great pitching performances, so maybe there's an overrepresentation of top WAR single seasons for pitchers rather than for hitters. Obviously, the book does not lend itself to that reading because it goes by franchise rather than by decade. But I certainly wanted to ask you that. Did you, as you were sorting through the data, did you find that maybe on a decade by decade there were some trends that perhaps favored hitters over pitchers more when
I mean,
there
certainly is with raw stats, and that's why we need things like win shares and WAR and WPA to help even those out. I think the argument is, does WAR do enough to do that? Does OPS plus do enough to do that? Does win shares do enough to do that? So, I mean, to some extent, like the 1968 pitching dominant season, there are some high pitching WAR results, but some players that had really good ERAs and really good other pitching stats aren't as high in WAR as they might have been in other seasons if they'd had those identical raw numbers, because it is trying to average and sort of take care of that for us. I didn't notice anything in this analysis. I think if you were to do a study like this, but really dive into things a decade at a time, then you would probably see some of that. Some oddities come out that WAR isn't properly taking into consideration, or maybe better to say we subjectively think it isn't. Maybe it really is, and it's our perceptions that are wrong. It's one of those nuances that can go back and forth.
Yeah, thanks.
We're seeing here, Nathan, I'm seeing your chat here about Cabrera, 7.5 baseball reference WAR in 2013. But he had a 190 OPS plus. So certainly if it was a chart of highest OPS pluses, he'd probably make that one.
Before we leave the hitters, a comment in all caps, no less. So there's a sense of urgency behind it about Darrell Evans, who, if I remember right, Bill James once called one of or the most underrated hitters in baseball history. Darrell Evans, I don't think he's going to put up the big WAR or the OPS, but did he? How close did he get to any of these lists?
Not so much for the Tigers. I think I looked at him for the Giants. I think that's where he played his most seasons, if I remember correctly. He didn't make the all-time Giants. He's definitely one of those players that had a great career, but he moved around a little bit. I don't think he made any all-time dream team. So it came up on the call last night. Do I have a roster of like best players to not make any dream team? And I haven't compiled that yet, but it's on my to-do list. And Evans might be one of those guys because he didn't make any of them.
And Mickey Stanley.
Yeah, right. One player actually that I mentioned on the call last night who does make one, but it's not really the one you'd expect. Fred McGriff comes very close to making a bunch of different teams, the Padres, the Blue Jays, the Braves. For me, he didn't make any of those, but he made the Rays. He made it as the backup first baseman for the lowly Tampa Rays. They don't have much of a history, and he only had a few seasons, but it was good enough to be the backup there. So you could, of course, make a case for McGriff for some of those other teams, but for me, he just didn't quite make the cut. A bit fewer seasons on the pitching side, but not too unbalanced. We saw last night for the White Sox, it was very unbalanced, way more pitching seasons than hitting seasons that had an 8 or higher WAR. Here you see the highest Tigers pitching seasons. A couple of things that jump out to me. Newhouser with that 3-year span, 44 through 46. All three of those make it. Of course, the Bird, 1976 makes it. And then there we see John Hiller, 1973, that outstanding relief season. He had several, but that one was off the charts. And McLean, not 1968, not the 30-win season, but the 69 campaign is the one that barely makes this list at 8.0.
Don't sleep on Mark Fidrich's performance on the field in '76. Of course, we remember the Magic Well, I wasn't born yet, but I'm told there was magic. There was
It was.
there was national media buzz. There was him talking to the ball. There was all of that, and all of that is what makes it so memorable. But don't sleep on his actual numbers. The guy could pitch.
Yep. Just didn't pitch very long. And then, yeah, good point in the chat there about McLean, the mound change after that dominant 68 season. So the numbers, well, McLean's numbers in 69 might not look as good as 68 relative to the year. They were better. And again, for better or worse, to War's credit, I think War realizes that in the equation and so rates the 69 season as superior.
Makes a perfect amount of sense, too. It's just considering that some of those pitchers after 68 didn't adjust, but McLean did, even though he's having arm issues at that point.
Yeah. Only one of Verlander's seasons makes it here, 2011. Interesting list. Killian, not someone you'd necessarily expect, but there he is. 25-win season, 1.78 ERA, back when a lot of people had ERAs that were that microscopic, but still. Good for Ed Killian. All right. We've gone through the whole Tigers. Let's have some fun with this. We did this last night. So Nathan and Robert, you're not allowed to ruin the fun for everyone here that already know all the answers.
What if I forgot them all?
Yeah, a little bit of setup here. So in the book, I choose one franchise player for each team. So for the Tigers, pretty clearly it's Ty Cobb. You can find him in the second row, third from the right with his traditional stance. Some other obvious ones, Babe Ruth in the lower left corner represents the Yankees. George Brett is on here somewhere representing the Royals. For some other teams, it was a much more difficult decision. I always give the example of the Dodgers. Their best franchise player could be Jackie Robinson, Sandy Koufax, Clayton Kershaw, Duke Snider, Pee Wee Reese, Roy Campanella. I mean, there's lots of candidates. I ended up going with Jackie Robinson, not because of breaking the color line, but just based on his numbers for the career that he had with them. But it is a closer call. So here, we can have a little fun. You can either come off mute or you can use the chat. Let's try and guess. We'll start with the first row. Can you guess who these players are? One for each team, one representing each team, just based on their silhouettes alone. So first row only. Go ahead.
Stan Musial, second from the left.
Yep, Stan Musial. Tom Seaver, I see in the chat, third from the left.
Ricky Henderson.
Yep, two people chiming in with Ricky Henderson running there, fifth.
Ted Williams at the end, Hank Aaron.
Ted Williams and Hank Aaron are the two on the far right. That's right.
Randy Johnson, fourth in from the right.
Right, and he's representing the Diamondbacks, actually.
Okay.
Is that Barry Bonds on the left, far left?
Nope, it looks like his swing, but it's not Barry.
Far left, Albert Pujols.
No.
Looks like his swing too, but no, it's not Albert Pujols because Stan Musial represents the Cardinals.
Ortiz. No.
Nope, not Ortiz. Keep in mind, it's got to be a guy that would be a sensible franchise player for that team.
I got it.
Who do we have left now in that
So
row?
we've got first position, the fourth position, sixth and seventh and eighth.
Is the third one from the right, Ivan Rodriguez?
It is good.
Very
that one's
nice.
not easy.
Very
That's
good.
from the
Good one.
representing the Rangers. Yep.
That one took us a while yesterday.
That's a good one. Boy.
All right, I'll give you the three teams that are remaining. So the first, fourth, and sixth. The teams here are the Rockies, the Angels, and the Padres.
Is the first one Todd Helton?
It is Todd Helton representing the Rockies. Angels and Padres.
Give us the numbers again of the position.
Fourth and sixth.
Fourth and sixth.
Fourth and sixth. Thank you.
Tony Gwynn, yeah, you got it there in
Okay.
the chat for the Padres. And then who's that outfielder leaping the fourth spot for the Angels?
Trout.
Yeah, Mike Trout. Very good. All right, let's go to row two. Who do you see there besides Ty Cobb is third from the right. We already know that one.
Walter
Willie
Johnson.
Mays. Willie
Walter
Mays, the
Johnson.
last one.
Yep, Willie Mays.
Walter Johnson, the fifth one in from the left.
That's right, Walter Johnson.
Honus Wagner next to Mays?
No, that's not Honus.
No?
It
No?
looks like his stride, but it's not him.
Yeah. No.
Hold that thought, though, on Honus.
Yeah, he'll be in the final row.
Yeah.
Johnny Bench, the fourth one from the left.
No, it's a catcher, but it's not Johnny Bench.
Cy
Mike
Young?
Schmidt, the third from the left.
Yeah, Mike Schmidt, third from the left. That's right, for the Phillies.
Is it like Cy Young?
No, not Cy Young.
Oh, shoot.
All right, so the second from the right, in between Cobb and Mays, I'll give you that one because I already mentioned it. That's Jackie Robinson from the Dodgers.
Okay, all right.
And then fourth from the right is somebody that I already mentioned, but I'll see if you can guess it. It's a pretty
George
clear-cut, yeah, George Brett for the Royals, one of the
Okay.
more obvious franchise players, but not necessarily an obvious silhouette. In between Brett and Johnson, who's that sweet swinger?
Yeah, Bonds?
Mariners.
Griffey.
Griffey for the Mariners. That's right. All right. So now we've got three left. Positions 1, 2, and 4, and the teams are the White Sox, the Rays, and the Expos.
Frank Thomas.
Frank Thomas.
Catcher's
Jerry Carter.
Gary
Good.
Carter's the
Gary
fourth
Carter,
one.
very good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the second one for the Tampa Bay Rays.
Longoria.
Longoria, yeah. Not someone you'd expect to be a franchise player, but given the Rays' short history,
There you go.
he's the best they've had. All right, the bottom row, we got Babe Ruth on the far left.
Bob
Bob
Feller.
Feller.
Bob Feller's number 2, that's right.
Cal Ripken.
Yep, Ripken's number 3.
Bench.
Bench is number 4. We're on a roll. And now it gets hard.
Cap
Anson.
Anson.
Cap
There you go.
Anson for the Cubs. That's right. I went with
Good one.
Anson over Ernie Banks as the Cubs franchise player.
Okay. Is it?
The fourth from the right, Nolan Ryan.
Not Nolan Ryan. He makes 3 different franchises, but you know, he didn't stay with one of them long enough to be the franchise player. It does look like him though in terms of the pitching angle.
Is the third from the right, Frank Robinson.
Nope. He too split his time with the Reds and Orioles, so wouldn't have been strong enough to make either one.
Is that A-Rod next to Anson?
Nope.
No?
Not A-Rod.
No, because that was Griffey.
Usual?
That's right.
Is that unusual?
No.
Usual was in the first row.
Oh,
So the one in between Anson and the pitcher is an Astro.
Altuve?
No, although he might end up being their franchise player.
Bagwell.
No, he had the leg kick, but it's the other leg kick guy.
EGO.
Biggio, right.
Yeah, the Super
It could have
Bees,
been
huh?
Bagwell.
Yeah.
It could have
Yeah.
been Bagwell. It was a close call, but I went with Biggio.
Is that pitcher Dave Stieb on the?
It is Dave
Very
Steve. That's
good.
that's one of the tough ones.
Woo.
Blue Jays don't have a clear-cut franchise player, but I went with Steve. All right, the third from the right is no longer on the Marlins, but it is the Marlins franchise player.
Stanton.
Yeah, Giancarlo
Yeah.
Stanton.
Okay.
Second from the right, lifelong Milwaukee Brewer.
Robin Yount.
Robin Yale.
Robin Yount.
Yeah. there you
And
go.
then the bottom right is someone that was already named.
Honus Wagner.
Honus Wagner for the Pirates. That's right. Very good. I handed this out as a worksheet at the last SABR convention in San Diego. And the best I've seen anyone do, just standing in front of me staring at it for 5 minutes, is the local leader of my Rochester SABR chapter, a guy named Ryan. He got 22 out of 30 without batting an eye. That's pretty
Yeah.
good, given that some of them are not easy. So just to wrap things up here, I mentioned that Out of the Park Baseball, the simulation game, really, there's lots of people have different favorites, but in my view, this is sort of the strongest simulation out there that's digital, at least. That's the one that MLB has partnered with. They do a lot together. They did that bracket challenge that I mentioned, which was fun. All-time dream teams. Of course, I was into watching the results. Like I said, the Yankees beat the Reds in the World Series. Each round was a 7-game series, and anything can happen in 7 games. So there were some odd results. Like in round 1, I mentioned this on the call last night, the Giants somehow lost to the Brewers. Now, I don't know how in any 7-game series, if you've got Higuera and Ben Sheets and Yovani Gallardo as your starting pitchers going up against the Giants with Mays and Ott and Bonds and McCovey and on and on and on. I don't know how they could lose, but somehow they did. Anyway, it doesn't cast doubt on what I think is otherwise a strong simulation. So I'm going to be running 100 full seasons. I think with that kind of data, it'll go through any ups and downs like I just mentioned with the Giants Brewers. And it'll be interesting. How many times will the Yankees win the championship? How many times will your Tigers win the championship out of 100 full seasons? If I had to guess, I might say the Yankees win it 20 or 30 times, but it certainly wouldn't be near all the time. For one thing, they've got a great lineup and they've got a great bullpen, but the Yankees starting pitching isn't as strong as I'd say half the other long-standing teams. You could name off the Dodgers, the Red Sox, the Giants, the Phillies. They'd all have a stronger rotation than the Yankees will. So it'll be interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see how the expansion teams do. I think the Astros will do well. I think the Mets will do well, both in part because of strong pitching. And then it'll be interesting to see, like, do the Rays often beat the Yankees, just to take 2 extremes, right? It'll be fun. So I'm going to do that. I'm still hoping to do it. I was going to have done it by now. OOTP, of course, understandably needed to partner with MLB to do their bracket stuff. And so they had to push the project with me off for a little bit, but hopefully this fall we'll get that underway. And then I'll publish the results when I update the book after the 2021 season and probably before then in some blog posts and stuff. Last thing, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, I'm not really a simulation guy, but are those on neutral fields or do they take the ballparks into consideration?
Yeah, you can do anything you want. You can have it be on a totally neutral field, just some random like computer field. You can have every game be in Coors Field and have a lot of offense. You could have it be in the old Baker Bowl where some of the Phillies had great seasons. You know, you could have it be in any, and they will take into account the park factors. They've got wind, they've got the dimensions of the outfield. They've got all of that that they can factor in. So, of course, any of it, if you just tweak a few numbers randomly in the simulation, it'll throw off the results. So it's all just numbers and computers, of course. Takes some of the humanness out of it. But nonetheless, it should be an interesting exercise just to see what the results would be if we can get it as close to what would seem to be accurate as possible. Last thing I'll mention, I don't have these available yet, but I am going to be creating some products with all the silhouettes I've created. You see here, I've done way more than create the 30 silhouettes that are in the book. I've created a bunch for each team. So far, I've only created those 3 for the Tigers. I've got 7 here for the Orioles. I plan to create coffee mugs and t-shirts and all kinds of stuff. It's pretty easy to create things when you make little bits of art like this. And I'm not an artistic guy at all. I'm obviously more of an analyst and a researcher, but it's easy enough in Photoshop to create silhouettes. They take about 20 minutes for me to do each. And I will demonstrate the one that since COVID started as a test, I got my own mask right here. So those 5 players are Babe Ruth, Christy Mathewson, Walter Johnson, Ty Cobb, and Honus Wagner. What do those 5 guys have in common? See a few
Rich,
head nodding.
yeah,
Rich
you
is
know.
saying, yeah, number 1, the first class into the Hall of Fame, right, 1936. When COVID started, I wanted to have a first class mask, and sure enough, I do. So,
and I mentioned yesterday, Cobb missed the photo for
photo
with the other guys. So if you want to see all 5 guys together, you have to look at your mask.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So thanks everybody. This was like all the other calls I've done. This was a lot of fun. You guys were a great interactive group. I saw the comment in the chat there about Cap Anson. Does his history of racism come into play? That certainly would be an argument against him if you want to say that as the Cubs franchise player. I think he would be deserving of statistically of making their dream team. But if you wanted to go with Banks over Anson as the Cubs franchise player on that basis, you certainly could. I didn't do that in the book, and it raises a good additional point that I didn't mention. I also didn't discount any of the stats from the steroid users or suspected steroid users, nor did I exclude Joe Jackson or Pete Rose, anyone that's out of the Hall of Fame. I leave it to the reader to figure out, how many fewer home runs would Sammy Sosa have hit or Barry Bonds or whatever. None of us know for sure, and so to try and discount their stats by some percentage would be, arbitrary, and we'd all argue about what that discount should be. So I didn't do that. I took all the stats at face value, but then I did mention in my write-ups that, take this with a grain of salt, this guy's stats or that guy's stats, because we all know that some of them are pretty well suspected or known of having cheated. So.
Any other questions for Tom? Tom, you've been really gracious in receiving our comments and questions along the way. So I think a lot of us that came in with bones to pick got to pick them. But any other questions? The Cap Anson question is a good one. Any others, and especially those who are joining by phone or don't have video, let us know if you want to jump in. But I do want to say, Tom, if there are no other comments, first of all, thanks so much for being with us. And I want to say this book is such an impressive achievement. You went through all the times that people have done different dream teams. And from now on, anytime anybody attempts that, they're going to have to reckon with this book. They're not going to have to agree with this book.
No, of course
necessarily, but
Yep.
they're going to have to reckon with it because you've done your homework and you've compiled a lot of important information here. And so I also want to say, you mentioned you're going to be doing a new edition. So I'm wondering if we can ask you when that new edition comes out to come back and tell us what's changed, what hasn't changed, and just give us the report from your beat covering the all-time Tigers.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I plan to make a round of SABR presentations when it happens. It won't be until after the 2021 season, so probably early, like that off season from November to January of 2021/2022. That's when I'll be doing radio interviews for the new book and the updated version, and would be happy to come back and talk with you all. Be a much shorter conversation because we wouldn't have to cover all the same ground, but we could talk about what's changed. And in particular, I could present how the Tigers do in my simulation thing too.
Yeah, we want to know if they win any championships because
Right.
that might be our best bet to get some.
For a little while.
Yeah, it's things are changing now. Thanks again, Tom, and thanks to all of you. Zoom was a bit of an experiment for us, and I really enjoyed the interaction and seeing and hearing from you all. And so that was good to see. Remember all the upcoming events that we have, especially in September, Open Forum September 13, Negro League Centennial Symposium. All of those things are coming up. So stay tuned, and much more is ahead. But for tonight, Tom, thank you once more, and thanks everyone for the conversation.
Thanks, guys.
you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.